Okay, welcome to the fifth video in Hume, the first video on section 2 of the inquiry. So far we've compared Locke and Hume and Descartes in a few respects, and we've discussed their respective methods. And last time we were discussing Hume's method and how there are two parts to it. How he's going to be performing both a kind of mental geography, and he's going to be attempting to be the Newton of the mind and uncovering the secret springs and principles, the laws, the fundamental laws that govern why we have perceptions when we do. And in this video, we're going to be turning to material in section 2 of the inquiry. And this is really where Hume begins his mental geography. And so the first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to lay out some of the main actors, some of the main characters that show up in Hume's mental geography. And so in Hume, the terminology shifts a bit, both from Descartes and from Locke. So for Hume, perceptions or perceptions of the mind will be the most general term that covers all mental entities, all of the characters in the mind, all of the representations of the mind. So we're going to have perceptions. And to hear, see, or feel, to hate, desire, or to will, to remember, to imagine, to conceive, those are all going to be perceptions. So what I'd like to do now is fill out some of the main distinctions between human perceptions. And I would normally have you guys do this. So you should think, what's the main division between the kinds of perceptions? So pause the video and think about that. And in particular, how does Hume distinguish various perceptions? Well, he's going to do it in terms of degrees of something. What's that? How does he distinguish them in terms of degree? How do some perceptions have more degree of what, less degree of what? Pause the video, take a moment. Okay, so what's the main division? Well, the main division that Hume is going to draw is between impressions and ideas, right? And ideas for Hume are going to be weak perceptions, perceptions with less force and vivacity. And in distinguishing ideas from other perceptions, he's looking for a difference in the geography of the mind, a difference in the character of our perceptions, such that we can divide sensations or impressions and ideas. So the difference is going to be in the degree of force, liveliness, or vivacity. So that's what you should put here. So it's going to be a difference in force, liveliness, or vivaciousness, or vivacity. And the idea is impressions are going to have more, and ideas are going to have less. So ideas are going to be weaker, and impressions are going to be stronger. And so he also divides impressions. How does he divide up impressions? You might also want to pause the video here. How is it that impressions get divided? Well, he's going to divide those into sensations and passions. And he gives examples of all three of these kinds of perceptions. So examples he gives of sensations are what we hear or see or feel. And examples of passions are going to be hatred or desire or love, things that involve our will. And examples of ideas, which are going to be faint, right? They're going to have less force in vivacity, so they're going to be fainter perceptions, are going to be things that we remember, imagine, or conceive. And okay, so those are the basics of Hume's mental geography. And one thing to bear in mind is the very same thing can be an object of an impression or an idea. So for example, I hate Bobby Brewster, right? That's a passion. It's a passion that I hate Bobby Brewster. Right? If I hate him, that's a way that I feel towards him. But I can also, it could be the case that I remember that I hate Bobby Brewster. And that's an idea, right? That's a memory. That's not something, that's an idea that I form of the hatred. And so the only distinction, Hume thinks, between impressions and ideas is their force and vivacity. It's a kind of qualitative notion. There's a threshold, right? So impressions are always going to be above that threshold, and ideas are always going to be below it. The ideas have less force and vivacity because they're copies, right? The ideas are copies of the impressions. So to fill this out a bit, right? The only distinction between impressions and ideas is their degree of force and vivacity. Right, vivacity is just, viva Las Vegas, or life in Latin is viva. And so vivacity just comes from that Latin root, viva, and it just means life. And so vivacity is just another word for liveliness, okay? Okay. So on this view, remembering my hatred of Bobby Brewster is just a faint way of hating him. And in a way, you can see how this seems plausible, right? When I recall how much I hated him after he punched me in the third grade, I have a kind of little bit of hatred, but it's not very much, right? I don't still hate him. The passion has died down. Now I only have an idea of it, the memory of my hatred of Bobby Brewster. But the memory is just a fainter version of the hate that I had in the third grade. So I did hate Bobby Brewster in the third grade. That was a passion, right? That was something that I felt very strongly. But now I don't hate him. that was a long time ago. I barely remember it. And so that mere memory, that idea that I have of my past hatred, that's a fainter version of the hatred that I had in 3rd grade. And it doesn't actually count as hatred anymore. It's not actually a passion anymore. Another way to get at this distinction is between perceptions above and below the threshold. And a way to do that is to distinguish between what we imagine and what we sense. So for example, all of the powers of imagination can't make me mistake a description of a landscape for an actual landscape, right? I'm never gonna mistake seeing a painting of a landscape for seeing the landscape itself. And in this way, the distinction between the relative force and vivacity of an impression and an idea has to do with how we relate to them in life, in what we do, right? I mean, suppose you're walking, right? And you see a desk. Well, you're going to avoid that desk. You're not going to walk into it, right? And this goes along with you avoiding what you take to be real. But if it was merely imagined, if you merely imagined a desk, well, then you wouldn't avoid it. You wouldn't change the way you walk at all, right? And so this degree, this threshold, has to do with what you take to be real and what you don't take to be real. This isn't a distinction between what you're paying attention to or not paying attention to. So take, for example, suppose you're watching a horror movie, right? Suppose you're watching A Clockwork Orange, and you're attending to all of the ultra violence on screen and eating your popcorn, and then all of a sudden you feel a cockroach in your popcorn. You jump up, and although you're paying more attention to the movie, the roach has more vivacity because it's what you take to be real. And in a similar way, I can remember that I hated Bobby Brewster and yet no longer treat this hatred as real. My memory, my mere idea of my hatred does not affect me in the way that real hatred does, right? So there's a distinction in reality. Reality, right? I treat the things up here as more real and the things down here as less real, right? And you can see that with the cockroach example or with the desk example. Okay. In the next video, we'll turn to the copy principle.